Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last short while, because, of course, we were only given very little time, I've expressed very serious concerns about C-5 as it relates to the constitutional rights of Indigenous peoples, the protection of our environment, and workers' rights. And I'd like to thank my colleague, my very brilliant colleague, the member from Vancouver East, for helping us split the bill to ensure that the Liberals and the Conservatives can't hide behind interprovincial trade barriers to violate Indigenous rights and accelerate the climate emergency. In spite of the amendments, and my concerns remain, the Building Canada Act constitutes a clear breach and violations of Indigenous rights under the Constitution and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Yesterday, in his press conference, the Prime Minister insisted that, in quotes, Indigenous peoples are at the heart of Bill C-5. Well, Mr. Speaker, in a way he's correct. The violation of the rights of Indigenous peoples is indeed at the heart of this bill. And Indigenous leaders that have traveled to the Hill last week or this week have confirmed this loud and clear. In response to questions both in committee and in the House, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations has failed repeatedly to provide clear answers to the serious concerns raised by Indigenous people and leaders. Bill C-5 will have serious and far-reaching implications as it allows the ministers and governor in council to determine what Indigenous rights, in quotes, may be adversely affected, or what will, in quotes, advance the interests of Indigenous peoples. Yet the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations seems content to simply state that Section 35 rights of the Constitution Act of 1982 are mentioned in certain provisions of the bill, or that her government will establish a $40 million advisory circle for what she characterized as, in quotes, guidance. Well, Mr. Speaker, as legislators, we are guided by the rule of law. We are guided by the Constitution and treaties, and for that, for the last 150 years, the Supreme Court of Canada has been providing clear guidance, in fact, with respect to Aboriginal rights and treaty rights. Furthermore, Bill C-15 requires that the government must ensure that all laws of this Parliament are consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Article 19 of the UN DRIP reads as follows, in quotes, states shall consult and cooperate in good faith with the Indigenous peoples in order to obtain their free, prior and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect them. I asked the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations in committee if this obligation was respected. Her response? The answer was no. Why? Because Bill C-5 was, in her words, an accelerated process. The minister likes to point out that Section 35 rights are mentioned in Bill C-5 and will be upheld, but always remains unconvincingly vague about how her government will achieve that. Allow me, Mr. Speaker, to provide just one example around modern land claims agreements. So modern land claims agreements considered as treaties under Section 35(3) of the Constitution Act 1982 contain distinct environmental and review processes in which the Indigenous signatories have a direct involvement and participation in decision-making and appointments. These processes have now been replaced by ministers and the Cabinet under Bill C-5. This constitutes a substantial amendment to these treaties and agreements. And this normally and legally requires the consent of Indigenous signatories. Consent has not been obtained from Indigenous peoples to make these substantial changes. In fact, the Grand Council The Grand Chief of the Grand Council of the Crees, in his correspondence with this government, correctly reminds us that the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement is a modern treaty within the meaning of Section 35 of the Constitution. And as such, it has a constitutional status that prevails over any inconsistent legislation. Consequently, Grand Chief Wapache has specifically proposed that the following, in quotes, that the proposed Building Canada Act expressively provide that it shall not apply to any project to be carried out in whole or in part in the territory covered by the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement. Mr. Speaker, this is just one example of the many that compels Indigenous leaders to strongly believe that Bill C-5 has the very real potential to lead us all to the courts, with the equally real risk further delays and job losses. We're not building a strong economy, we're building cases for the Supreme Court of Canada. It is the kind of legislative behavior that has held the federal government, or that has resulted in the federal government spending between $500 million to $1 billion annually fighting Indigenous peoples' rights and status in courts. As Grand Chief Elvin Fiddler claimed, in quotes, if you pass this Bill C-5, it will be a long, hot summer. We will not sit idly by and watch any government, whether it's Ontario or Canada, to come to our territory and take whatever they want because it is ours. And it's not just the rights of Indigenous peoples that are being violated. The Building Canada Act risks eroding workers' rights, giving the minister the ability to bypass critical legislation protecting workers, eroding standards surrounding health and safety. And even beyond these glaring attacks on workers, Bill C-5 would also be a job killer, since the government failed to undertake the necessary consultations, fulfill their constitutional obligations meaningfully, that this legislation will inevitably get tied up in the courts, stalling any sort of economic growth. Beyond these issues, countless environmental organizations have warned that Bill C-5 will accelerate the climate emergency, placing countless people across Canada at risk. In fact, 1 in 4 Canadians are suffering the adverse health impacts resulting from the climate emergency. Eco-Justice says the bill gives, in quotes, sweeping powers for the Prime Minister and his cabinet to exempt major projects from Canada's most important federal health, safety, and environmental laws, and that it encourage, in quotes, backroom politicking and closed-door negotiation with powerful corporations. Right now, half our country is literally on fire. And when 1 in 4 Canadians, as I said, health is being impacted by extreme weather events, and these events will only, we know, weakening environmental standards will only make this worse in the future. Nobody voted for an undemocratic concentration of power, violations of the rights of Indigenous peoples' constitutional rights, environmental degradation, or attacks on workers. Right now, the Liberals, and being supported by the Conservatives, in fact, Mr. Speaker, are together holding our country hostage to prioritize big corporations' interests over everything else. We urge the government to slow down, to reflect, to not let this bill go through in its current form. We urge the government to honor its obligation to obtain free, prior, and informed consent and significantly amend this bill to uphold constitutional obligations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.